The sun rises over the Pacific, painting the horizon in blood-red light. The sea below glitters, calm for a moment, before the roar of engines tears it apart. High above, a Japanese Zero cuts through the sky. Its pilot leans forward, grinning beneath the canopy. Down below, American planes spiral in flames, black smoke trailing like dying comets. On the radio, laughter crackles. The young pilots of the Imperial Navy mock their opponents. To them, American aircraft are slow, clumsy, easy prey. Like children, one would later recall. And in those early years of the war it seemed true. But history has a way of turning laughter into silence. What happens when a nation mocked for weakness learns, adapts, and answers with overwhelming power? What happens when the hunted become the hunters? The answer would come in June of 1944. In a battle so one-sided, American pilots gave it a name that still echoes today: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Before we dive in, a quick note. If you love long-form history, if you want more deep dives into the hidden corners of World War II, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. It helps this channel grow, and it means you won't miss the next story waiting just over the horizon. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the skies belonged to Japan. The Mitsubishi A6M0, slender and graceful, seemed untouchable. American pilots who first faced it were stunned by its speed, its climb, and its ability to turn so tightly it seemed to defy physics. Imagine yourself in 1942 strapped into a stubby little F4F Wildcat, heavy on the stick, its engine groaning as you pull into a climb. Suddenly, a Zero whips past, banking effortlessly, its wingtips nearly kissing the water before it climbs away. What chance would you have? Would you press the fight or dive for the ocean and pray? For months the Zero dominated. At Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, across the Dutch East Indies, American and Allied aircraft fell in droves. Pilots described being outmaneuvered at every turn. Even when they scored hits, the Zero's pilots seemed almost supernatural, darting away, returning again, striking from the sun. Part of the secret lay in design. The Zero carried no armor to protect its pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks to keep it alive when hit. That made it dangerously vulnerable, but also gave it range and agility unmatched by any Western fighter at the time. It was a weapon built for attack, not survival. The effect on morale was devastating. Reports filtered back to Washington describing squadrons wiped out, veterans cut down in their first combat sorties. They were just better, one American pilot admitted after a narrow escape. And yet, behind the humiliation, something important was happening. The U.S. Navy was watching, learning, and asking a dangerous question. If the Zero had weaknesses, how could they be turned into an American answer? The Zero was more than just an airplane. To the Japanese, it symbolized national genius. Its long wings and slender fuselage weren't only products of engineering, they were the embodiment of an empire's belief in its own destiny. Newspapers celebrated it as invincible. Pilots believed it gave them wings worthy of samurai warriors. And for a time the world seemed to agree. American aircraft, by contrast, seemed clumsy, almost primitive. The Buffalo fighter, used in the early months of the war, was so underpowered that pilots joked its best feature was its ability to sink gracefully when shot down. The Wildcat, sturdier but slower, could barely keep up with the Zero in a turning fight. Young American aviators, many fresh from stateside training, went into combat with fear gnawing at their guts. What would it feel like to climb into a cockpit knowing the odds were stacked against you? Would you still believe in survival, or would you tell yourself that every mission might be your last? The numbers were stark. In the Philippines, in Malaya, in the skies over Java, Allied air forces were swept aside. At Coral Sea and even at Midway, despite the American victory, pilots spoke of dueling with an enemy that seemed always one step ahead. Zero pilots laughed over radios, taunted their foes, and carried themselves with the arrogance of men who thought they could not be replaced. But beneath that arrogance lay a hidden fragility. Japan's pilot corps was small, elite, and difficult to replenish. Their planes were masterpieces of agility but carried no margin for error. The United States, meanwhile, was waking up. Engineers at Grumman were already sketching new designs. Commanders were rethinking tactics. And raw recruits were being funneled through a training system that would soon dwarf anything Japan could manage. The tide had not yet turned, but the seeds were planted. The question lingered in every ready room and on every carrier deck. How long could the Zero's supremacy last? The summer of 1942 revealed something astonishing. At Midway, 4 Japanese carriers steamed forward, confident that their fighters and bombers would overwhelm anything the Americans dared to launch. Their Zero squadrons had been kings of the sky for months, and many pilots believed they could not be touched. Yet within days, those 4 proud carriers lay crippled or sinking, their aircraft scattered across the sea. The United States had struck a blow so devastating that it changed the balance of the war. And yet, behind the victory, American pilots felt a strange unease. They had won not because their fighters were better, but because luck, courage, and a few desperate maneuvers had tipped the scale. The Wildcat could hold its own in a pinch, but it was never enough to guarantee control of the air. One of the lessons of Midway was that tactics could close some of the gap. Commander John Thatch had already designed a maneuver that came to be known as the Thatch Weave, a clever dance between 2 Wildcats, protecting each other, using teamwork to trap the faster Zero in their overlapping fields of fire. It worked, but it required perfect timing and absolute trust. American pilots soon realized they could not rely on clever tricks alone. They needed something more. They needed a machine built not for compromise but for victory. In Long Island, New York, engineers at Grumman Aircraft were already working on just such a solution. They had studied fragments of crashed Zeros, read every combat report, and listened carefully to the words of those who had faced the enemy up close. They asked themselves one unforgiving question. How do you design an airplane that not only matches the Zero but destroys its advantage completely? The answer emerged in the form of the F6F Hellcat. It was a bigger aircraft than the Wildcat, heavier and less graceful to the eye, but its beauty lay in brute survival. Armor plates shielded the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant a burst of enemy fire would not instantly turn the cockpit into an inferno. Beneath the nose rumbled a powerful engine, strong enough to push the plane to nearly 380 miles per hour, giving it both speed and climb the Zero struggled to match. 6 heavy .50 caliber Browning machine guns lined the wings, delivering a storm of bullets that could shred anything in their path. If you were a 20-year-old pilot climbing into your first combat machine, which would you choose? A fragile, nimble Zero built to strike but not survive? Or the Hellcat, a brawler that might lack elegance but could take a punch and give one back twice as hard? That contrast captured the essence of the Pacific Air War. The Zero demanded perfection, a flawless pilot flying flawlessly. The Hellcat forgave mistakes. And in war, forgiveness meant survival. Just as important as the machine itself was the way America prepared its men to fly it. By 1943, the U.S. had built a vast training system that stretched from coast to coast. Young recruits cycled through ground school, gunnery ranges, mock dogfights and carrier landing practice before ever facing the enemy. They flew hundreds of hours before combat. Mistakes cost only embarrassment, not lives. Japan, by contrast, had no such luxury. By 1944, the Imperial Navy was rushing pilots through abbreviated courses. Flight hours shrank. Simulators were non-existent. Instructors were scarce. Many Japanese recruits arrived at the front with barely 100 hours in the air. Against them stood Americans with 3 or 4 times that experience, strapped into machines that could take them home even when riddled with holes. What wins a war in the sky? The skill of a few aces, or the steady competence of thousands of well-trained pilots? By 1944, the answer was becoming clear. Japan still had brave men, but their experience was thinning out with every loss. The United States was producing not just planes by the thousands, but pilots to match. The balance was shifting from quality to overwhelming quantity, and quantity, when married to solid training and reliable machines, could crush even the proudest elite. By the summer of 1944, both sides were staring at a coming collision. The Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, formed the inner defensive ring of Japan's Pacific Empire. Lose them, and the American B-29 Superfortress bombers would have bases within range of the home islands. For Japan, the stakes could not be higher. For the U.S., seizing the Marianas meant cutting a direct path toward Tokyo. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded a massive fleet, carriers bristling with Hellcats and dive bombers, their decks crowded with young pilots itching for their first real taste of combat. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, leading the Japanese fleet, gathered every available carrier and launched his last reservoir of trained men, many of them still green. In ready rooms across the Pacific, men adjusted their goggles and studied maps. They checked ammunition belts, tightened harnesses, and traded nervous jokes. Above all, they knew what was coming. The Japanese had once laughed at American machines and pilots. Now they would throw everything into one desperate gamble to stop the advance. But the Americans had learned, adapted, and armed themselves with a fighter designed for the very moment now approaching. The stage was set for one of the greatest carrier battles in history, a clash not just of planes but of philosophies, of training systems, of nations' variability to endure war. The skies over the Philippine Sea would soon be filled with smoke, fire, and metal, and the world would watch as the laughter that once echoed over radios faded into silence. The morning of June 19, 1944, dawned clear over the Philippine Sea. The American fleet stretched across the water like a moving city, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, each churning a wake that foamed white in the sun. On the decks of the big Essex-class carriers, rows of Hellcats gleamed under their canvas covers, mechanics swarming over them, tightening bolts, fueling tanks, loading ammunition. Pilots sat in ready rooms, helmets resting on their knees, waiting for the call. Some tapped their feet nervously, others smoked in silence, eyes fixed on the wall maps where chalk marks traced the expected approach of the Japanese fleet. And then the alarms sounded. Enemy planes inbound. Radar operators had picked up wave after wave of Japanese aircraft sweeping toward the American Armada. It was the moment both sides had been waiting for. The great gamble of the Japanese combined fleet was beginning. Engines coughed to life, and the carrier's decks shook as Hellcats roared forward, climbing into the sky. From the cockpits, the horizon looked alive, specks growing larger, sunlight glinting off wings. Hundreds of aircraft were converging, a storm of steel and fire about to break over the sea. The Japanese pilots had been told they would smash through the American defenses, sink the carriers, and turn the tide of the war. Many of them were young, barely out of training, flying with nerves stretched tight. They knew the Zero's reputation, but few had ever fought against the rugged Hellcat. They expected another easy hunt. What they found instead was a wall of gunfire. Hellcats dove into the incoming formations with savage confidence. Their 6.50 caliber machine guns spat streams of tracers, slicing into bombers and fighters alike. Zeros tried to twist and turn as they had in years past, but the Hellcats were faster, more powerful, and flown by men drilled to fight as a team. One American pilot later recalled, "They came at us like target drones. We just cut through them." Imagine the scene, the air filled with contrails and smoke, planes bursting into flames, parachutes opening and then falling into the ocean. American gunners on the carriers below craned their necks, firing bursts into the sky as attackers broke through. A few bombs splashed into the water dangerously close to the decks, but most never made it that far. By noon, the Japanese had thrown 3 massive strikes against the American fleet. Each time, fewer aircraft returned. Some squadrons never came back at all. Pilots who had laughed only 2 years earlier now faced a slaughter so lopsided that stunned survivors could barely describe it. Hellcat pilots later counted dozens of kills in a single day. Japanese losses climbed into the hundreds. What must it have felt like, sitting in the cockpit of a Zero that morning, realizing too late that the tables had turned? Would you have pressed the attack or tried to break away, knowing that running might only delay the inevitable? The Americans nicknamed it almost immediately. One pilot, after landing back on his carrier, quipped, "It's just like a turkey shoot back home." The phrase spread through the fleet, carried by laughter and disbelief. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the name stuck, capturing both the scale of the destruction and the sense of stunned amazement at how quickly Japanese air power collapsed. By the end of the day, more than 350 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Americans lost around 30 in combat, a handful more to accidents or fuel shortages. It was a ratio so brutal that it defied belief. For years, Japanese aviators had been the hunters. On this day they were the hunted, cut down in wave after wave by a machine designed specifically to end their reign. Yet numbers alone cannot capture the human shock. On the carriers of the Japanese fleet, flight decks emptied, but few planes came home. Pilots who had grown up on tales of invincibility now sat in ready rooms staring at empty chairs. Commanders spoke in hushed tones, knowing they had no replacements left. The elite air arm of the Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been shattered in a single afternoon. For the Americans, the mood was triumphant, but also sobering. Pilots slapped each other on the back, celebrated their victories, but in the quiet corners of the ships, men knew they had witnessed the end of an era. The Zero had dominated, yes, but its time was finished. The Hellcat, mass-produced by the thousands, had taken the sky away for good. The battle did not end with that single day. Over the following hours and into June 20th, American aircraft hunted the retreating Japanese fleet, sinking carriers and hammering what little air power remained. But the essence of the fight was decided in those brutal hours when the Zero met the Hellcat head-on, and lost. History often turns on small things. At Pearl Harbor, Japan had laughed at the weakness of its enemy. At Midway, the Americans had proven they could strike back. At the Marianas, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. Laughter had turned to silence, arrogance to shock. The empire that once ruled the Pacific skies now looked upward and saw only defeat. The evening after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was strangely quiet. On the American carriers, pilots returned to the ready rooms, their flight suits damp with sweat, their ears still ringing from the roar of machine guns. The air smelled of oil and cordite, of salt carried in on the wind. Men slumped in their chairs, exhausted, some boasting of their kills, others silent, lost in thought. Victory had been overwhelming, but the scale of it left even the victors unsettled. How could an enemy once so feared collapse so completely? For the Japanese, the silence was heavier. On the decks of their carriers, commanders counted the planes that failed to return. Squadrons that had launched in proud formation came back broken or did not come back at all. Experienced veterans were gone, cut down in minutes. Young recruits had perished before they ever had a chance to grow. The backbone of Japan's air arm, once the sharpest sword in the Pacific, had been shattered. The consequences went far beyond numbers. The Japanese Navy had gambled its strength to protect the Marianas. When the gamble failed, the empire lost its shield. Without strong carrier air power, Japan could no longer challenge the U.S. fleet at sea. Its carriers became hollow shells, floating targets without the pilots to give them teeth. In the months ahead, American task forces would sail wherever they wished, striking at will, confident that no serious challenge would rise from the enemy's decks. The Hellcat had done its work. Mass-produced in factories across America, flown by thousands of young men trained in a system that valued endurance over brilliance, it had turned the tide. In total, the F6F Hellcat would account for the majority of all American aerial victories in the Pacific, a kill ratio unmatched by any other fighter of the war. Its pilots called it Grumman's Iron Works, rugged, dependable, forgiving. Where the Zero demanded perfection and punished mistakes with death, the Hellcat absorbed errors and gave its pilots another chance. That difference, multiplied across hundreds of battles, decided the fate of nations. But beyond the machines, the Turkey Shoot carried lessons about war itself. One of them was the danger of arrogance. In 1942, Japanese pilots had laughed at the clumsiness of their opponents. They believed superiority in skill and spirit would always overcome material weakness. Yet war is not static. Enemies learn. They adapt. The United States studied every defeat, measured every weakness, and built a weapon tailored to destroy the Zero's advantage. The laughter that once echoed over radios had become silence over the Philippine Sea. Another lesson lay in the power of industry. Japan could not replace its losses. Each fallen pilot was a year of training gone, each destroyed aircraft a machine that took precious resources to rebuild. America, by contrast, flooded the Pacific with new planes, new pilots, new carriers. Even if the Hellcat had been only equal to the Zero, sheer numbers would have tipped the scales. But because it was superior in design and durability, the imbalance grew catastrophic. What wins wars is not just bravery but the ability to sustain it. There is also the human cost to consider. Behind every number, every kill, every loss, was a life. A young man who once wrote letters home, who once dreamed of the future. For Japan, those losses tore holes in communities and families, leaving scars that lasted long after the war ended. For America, the victories came with grief too, for not every Hellcat returned to its deck. War's arithmetic is never clean. Even the most lopsided triumph carries tragedy within it. And yet, history also carries transformation. After the Marianas, the war pressed closer to Japan's heart. The islands fell one by one, and American B-29 bombers began to appear over Tokyo. The empire that once seemed unstoppable now fought on the defensive, cornered, desperate. The Turkey Shoot marked the moment when Japanese naval air power ceased to be a decisive force. From then on, the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer in doubt. Only the cost in lives and time before surrender came. Looking back today, the story of the Hellcat and the Zero is more than just a tale of machines. It is a story about adaptation, resilience, and the danger of underestimating an opponent. How often in history have the mighty fallen because they believed their strength eternal? How often have the underestimated risen by learning, by enduring, by building something greater? Perhaps that is why the great Marianas Turkey Shoot still fascinates us. It was not simply a battle but a turning point, a collapse of myth and the birth of a new reality. In those skies, under the glare of the Pacific sun, two visions of war collided, one built on speed, agility, and the pride of an elite few, the other built on armor, training, and the power of a nation's factories. When the smoke cleared, the world saw which vision would shape the future. As we close the story, ask yourself, what would you have felt sitting in the cockpit of a Hellcat that day watching enemy planes fall like leaves in autumn? Relief? Triumph? Or perhaps something quieter, the knowledge that war is not a game of glory but of survival? The Zero once ruled the skies. But in June 1944, over the Philippine Sea, its reign ended. The Hellcat had come, and with it came the silence of 1,000 falling engines, the silence that follows laughter when history changes course.